September 1942. The German war machine has ripped open the heart of Stalingrad. Block by block, the city is burning. 90% of it already lies in Nazi hands. But on one street corner, a single 4-story apartment building refuses to fall. Inside is a handful of elite Soviet fighters led by a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov. For approximately 60 days and nights, the Nazis threw everything at this crumbling husk of concrete: artillery, mortars, tanks, wave after wave of infantry. They expected it to collapse in hours. Instead, it became a fortress. When darkness fell, the Soviet defenders became predators. They knew the Germans shrank from two things: hand-to-hand fighting and the night itself. What happened in this one building didn't just inspire a city. It rewrote Soviet tactics, broke the illusion of Nazi invincibility, and changed the course of history forever. This is not just a tale of heroism. This is the forgotten, brutal story of Pavlov's house. By the autumn of 1942, Stalingrad was a city of fire and rubble. General Friedrich Paulus and the German Sixth Army had stormed in with tanks and artillery, leveling entire districts to ash. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And that's exactly what it was. Men crawling through sewers, snipers firing from blackened factories, soldiers butchering each other room by room, floor by floor, inside shattered apartment blocks. Still, the Germans pressed on. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name, and Hitler was convinced that if he captured it, Soviet resistance would crumble once and for all. But he was wrong. Near collapse, Soviet General Vasily Chuikov gave his men one order: not one step back. Amid the ruins stood an ordinary 4-story apartment block in an extraordinary position. It overlooked the town square and the riverbank, a vantage point that could decide the battle for the city. If the Soviets could take it, they could choke the German advance. In September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small band of men were sent to seize that building and hold it at any cost. What began as a desperate order would turn an ordinary apartment into a fortress, and a fortress into legend. Day 1, September 27th. On the night of September 27th, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men crawled on their bellies through the courtyard. The Germans were inside the apartment block, occupying rooms and using the windows as firing points over 9th January Square. Every shadow could have meant a patrol. Every sound could have meant death. If they were seen before reaching the walls, it would have been over before it even began. According to the men who were there, the Russians slipped into the building through the ground floor and found terrified civilians hiding in the cellar. The locals told them exactly where the Germans were holed up. Pavlov's men didn't hesitate. They kicked in the door of the apartment and ended it with grenades and gunfire. What followed was brutal hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets, knives, rifle butts. Men fought in the darkness of ruined rooms, choking on dust and smoke. The Soviets noticed something they had seen before. The Germans didn't like close-quarters fighting. They hated it. And they avoided night battles whenever possible, preferring to drink and play cards after sundown. That weakness had now been laid bare. When the last German inside was killed, Pavlov's men rushed machine guns to the upper floors and set up firing positions. The first German probes came almost at once, but they were thrown back in bursts of fire from the windows. In that instant, it became clear the building wasn't just another apartment block. Its position controlled the square, the approaches from the river, and the roads deeper into the city. Holding it meant controlling the ground for hundreds of yards in every direction. From that night forward, Pavlov's house was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. Days 2 and 3, September 28th and 29th. The morning after Pavlov's men seized the building, reinforcements arrived from the massive Red October mill. To most outside Stalingrad, the mill meant nothing. But to the men inside the city, it was a symbol. Its towering grain silos and concrete walls loomed over the battlefield, and the Soviets had turned it into a fortress of their own. The mill sat just behind Pavlov's house, and now its soldiers were coming forward with supplies and extra hands to strengthen the defense. Inside the apartment block, the men began transforming it from a home into a stronghold. They smashed through interior walls with picks and rifle butts, carving out firing slits that looked down into the square. Dust hung in the air, mixing with smoke from burning buildings outside. Each hole they made gave them a new angle of fire, turning ordinary windows and doorways into killing zones. At night, when the city fell into a tense silence broken only by distant artillery, the soldiers laid down barbed wire and mines around the building. It wasn't safe. Every movement outside risked being spotted by a German patrol or machine gun nest, but the Soviets worked quickly, stringing wire in the rubble and burying explosives in the earth. By dawn, Pavlov's house was ringed with steel teeth. Above them, artillery spotters climbed to the highest floors, scanning the square and the approaches from the river. The Volga, the great artery of Russia, lay just behind the city, and Soviet guns on the far bank waited for their signal. From these vantage points, the spotters could radio across the river and bring down artillery fire within minutes, blasting apart any German attempt to retake the block. Life inside the building settled into a brutal rhythm. When the bombardments came, and they came often, every man crammed into the cellar, huddling in the dark as shells smashed the walls above. Dust choked the air. The ground shook like an earthquake. And the moment the shelling lifted, they sprinted back upstairs to their guns, knowing the Germans would follow the bombardment with another assault. Day 4 to 7, September 30th, October 3rd. By the third day, Pavlov's house was no longer just a building. It was becoming the center of a fortress. The Soviets began carving trenches through the rubble, shallow ditches that stretched from the apartment block to the mill and to other nearby strongholds. These weren't fancy. They were just deep enough to let men crawl or crouch as they carried supplies, weapons, and reinforcements. But they were lifelines. Without them, anyone trying to cross open ground would have been torn apart by German machine guns. Inside, the men hacked crude passageways between rooms and apartments, creating what they called communication routes. It meant a soldier could move from one end of the building to the other without ever stepping into the open. The house was being rewired for war. The Germans had a nickname for the place too, Das Lichtturm, the lighthouse. From its upper floors, the Soviets could see in every direction, watching every street and every approach. Machine guns covered the square in front, while rifles and anti-tank weapons had long, deadly fields of fire stretching toward the riverbank. Any German foolish enough to cross the open ground in daylight was as good as dead. So the Germans adapted. Instead of rushing en masse, they sent small groups of infantry to probe the defenses, trying to sneak up close. But that played straight into the Soviets' hands. Close-in fighting inside a shattered city wasn't about tanks or heavy artillery. It was about speed, guts, and short-range weapons. The Russians excelled at this. Grenades, bayonets, and submachine guns spoke louder than German discipline or drill. In those tight corridors and darkened stairwells, the Soviets were merciless, and the Germans quickly learned that Pavlov's house was no easy prize. Day 10, early October. It didn't take long for the Germans to escalate. One morning, the rumble of engines echoed through the ruins and several panzers crept out into the open square. Their black crosses were plain against the dust and smoke, and with every crunch of their treads, the ground seemed to shake. Infantry followed in their wake, hunched behind the armor, ready to storm the building once the tanks blew it apart. The Soviets held their fire at first, letting the panzers edge closer. Then came the surprise. From the upper floors, where the tanks' guns couldn't elevate, Red Army soldiers leaned out with anti-tank rifles and opened fire. Heavy rounds cracked against armor plates, searching for weak spots. At the same time, machine guns in the windows stitched lines of bullets into the infantry, cutting down the men who thought the tanks would shield them. But the decisive blow came from across the river. On the roof and upper floors, Soviet artillery spotters watched the approach through shattered brickwork. The moment the Germans showed themselves, the spotters called in fire. Within minutes, shells screamed in from batteries on the far side of the Volga, landing with unnerving precision. Whole sections of the square erupted, and the panzers suddenly found themselves exposed in a kill zone they hadn't expected. Realizing they had blundered into a trap, the Germans broke off. The armor reversed out of the square, smoking and battered, while the surviving infantry melted back into the ruins. For the Soviets, it was a revelation. Tanks alone couldn't crack Pavlov's house. Mines, spotters, and firing angles made it a fortress no frontal assault could take. Days 14 to 30, mid-late October. By mid-October, the fight around Pavlov's house settled into a grim pattern. Outside the walls, Soviet storm groups went prowling through the ruins at night. These were small, heavily armed squads trained to fight at what the Russians called kiss range, so close you could smell the enemy sweat before you pulled the trigger. They would crawl through rubble, slip down alleys, and hit German positions in sudden, violent bursts. Grenades, submachine guns, knives. Then, before dawn, they vanished back into the shadows. Inside Pavlov's house, a different rhythm took hold. Rotations kept the garrison alive. One platoon manned the guns, scanning the square for the next German probe. Another slipped out under cover of dark to scavenge fuel, food, or ammunition from the ruins, anything they could carry back through a city that never stopped burning. The rest snatched minutes of sleep in the cellar, boots still on, rifles within arm's reach. No one ever fully relaxed. Morale became a weapon of its own. Cigarettes were passed hand to hand, smoked down to the filter. Soldiers told black jokes about death, trying to laugh just enough to keep the fear away. Some even sang in the pauses between bombardments, low, tired songs that echoed through the brick cellar like ghosts. Every detail of the house took on meaning. The stove in the cellar wasn't just warmth, it was survival, a place to boil what little food they had. The staircase became a lifeline, but only after dark, when snipers couldn't see the movement in its shadowed turns. The men lived like this for weeks, never knowing if the next shell would bring the ceiling down, or if they'd wake to another German assault at the door. Day 30-55, late October, mid-November. The rhythm of life in Pavlov's house settled into something almost mechanical. A flare lit the sky. The bombardment began. Men scrambled back to their posts, artillery fire was called in, and the assault was held off. Then it would start all over again. And the house was never truly an island. It was a node in a larger web. Trenches, barbed wire, minefields, and artillery support across the Volga. Together, these turned the apartment block into a killing ground. Anyone trying to take it head-on walked into a trap. But here's where the story often blurs into legend. Later retellings spoke of just 24 men holding Pavlov's house for 58 days, cut off and alone. The truth was more complicated. At different points, the garrison numbered not a few dozen, but sometimes over 100. And Sergeant Pavlov, though a hero, wasn't the sole commander. Men like Lieutenant Afanasyev and Captain Naumov directed much of the defense. Still, in the desperate winter of 1942, the Soviet people needed symbols. Pavlov's house became more than just a strong point. It became a story of ordinary soldiers standing unbreakable against Hitler's war machine. The myth grew because it had to. National pride demanded a legend, and in a way, that made the tale just as powerful as the reality. Day 58, November 24-25. By late November, the orders came down. Push across 9th January Square and take the neighboring fortress the men called the Milk House. Why? Because the Germans were using it as a firing nest, bleeding Pavlov's house from only a few hundred yards away. If the Soviets wanted to hold, they couldn't just sit behind their walls. They had to cut the threat out. The assault was brutal from the first step. Men who had lived under bombardment for nearly 2 months now had to charge headlong across open ground, under machine gun fire, through a square littered with corpses and wreckage. Many never made it. Among them was Captain Ivan Naumov, the senior officer coordinating much of the defense of Pavlov's house. He was killed in the open. At the same time, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov himself was hit, badly wounded, and pulled from the fight. His war at the house was over. What happened next became legend among the survivors. Under fire, they dragged Naumov's body back across the square. Down in the cellar, by lantern light, they buried him beneath the very building he had helped defend. To them, it wasn't just a comrade's grave. It was a vow. They would not abandon Pavlov's house, not after that. With Naumov dead and Pavlov evacuated, command passed to Captain Anton Dragan. The house had lost its namesake, but the fight didn't end. If anything, the defenders clung to it harder, because now it was no longer just a position. It was a tomb, a promise, and a symbol. By January 1943, the fight for Pavlov's house was entering its final act. The Soviets cleared the building once again, and within days, the German Sixth Army collapsed in the ruins of Stalingrad. Pavlov's house stood unbroken through months of chaos, and now you've seen why it became a legend. If you want more stories of courage, strategy, and history that changed the world, like this video, subscribe to Uncovered Past and turn on notifications. We have more untold stories coming your way. Thanks for watching.